Hello and welcome to Priority Zero, an engineering leadership podcast by Lead Dev. I'm your host today, Scott Carey, and I am joined by Matt Boyle. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here, thank you.
Matt, before we get started, just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So I'm Matt Boyle, I'm an engineering manager at Cloudflare. My main focus is developer tooling, so internal tooling. And we split developer tooling into sort of three, we call them pillars. One is developer infrastructure, one is developer productivity, and one is developer insights. So we use all those three things together to make sure that our engineers have the best possible and most stable path to production.
And how many engineers are you kind of serving with those tools?
Serving. So our team consists of around 17 engineers, and there's around 2,000 engineers at Cloudflare. Okay,
pretty big cohort of users.
Yes.
And it sounds to me like they kind of make sense, those three pillars, but tell me a little bit more about like the difference between those three different elements that you're thinking about.
Totally. So developer infrastructure I see as the foundational piece to all of this. So their role is mainly focused around making sure we have highly available infrastructure it's solid, basically. Like, it's not going to break. It's going to go through load testing. It's going to be ready for whatever challenges our engineers throw at it. Developer productivity build on top of that stable infrastructure, and their role is really to focus in on like how do we make it more efficient for engineers to ship to production, but also to focus in on happiness too. Like how does it feel to ship code? Like, is the tension there? Is there processes that aren't working? How do we fix those things? And then developer insights support both of those things. They give us insights, knowledge, and measurements as to like how's engineering doing, how are we performing, and that's not just necessarily for our team, but for other engineering managers, other individual contributors who may want to say, we made a change to a process 4 weeks ago. The goal of it was to improve the way we do X, like how are we doing? And so making sure we have that information like available for them so people can make decisions about where they spend their time and what they want to improve.
Great, and we're definitely going to get into those areas when we start talking about your Priority Zero. But before we do, I want to hear a little bit more about you. How did you get into software engineering?
Yeah, so I did the very typical thing. I did a computer science degree at the University of Birmingham. I loved computer science. And as part of it, I think it's quite common in the UK. I'm not sure how much it is globally, but I did a year in industry. As part of that year in industry, I worked for General Electric. I actually wasn't doing a software engineering role. I was doing more, I think I would call it like a project management role. It was about sort of managing software engineering teams and projects. So I did that for a year during university. And then I got really lucky in that they made me a return offer to go back to join them on the graduate scheme. And GE has a very formal graduate scheme. At the time, it was called the IT Leadership Program. I think now it's called like the Software Engineering Development Program. So they've shifted focus to recognize where technology is going. But what that program meant was you did 4 6-month rotations in 4 different parts of the business. And I don't actually think there was a better way I could have started my career. So I did some software engineering stuff, and I did some more sort of leadership and management stuff too.
Yeah.
And I think that made me a lot more balanced. Like I got to see not only like how big companies, like GE is one of the biggest in the world, how do they write code? How do they manage deployments? And then also, how do they manage big multi-million-dollar projects and migrations and things like that? So I spent 2 years doing that. Absolutely loved my time there, but I really wanted to go to a much smaller company too and experience what they had to offer. So I went from the biggest company I could find, which was GE, to one of the smallest, which was at the time was a company called Crowdcube, which is still around today. I think the engineering team at the time was like 12. Yeah. So it really was, a huge company to like complete opposite, and I loved it. And ever since then, I've been in love with the field. I've had a few jobs since then, and they've all taught me a lot, and it's a great job role to have.
So you love both those environments, and I think that's super interesting. You love the big company and the small company, and people tend to gravitate to one or the other. Like, did you find yourself gravitating to one or the other? I know you're at a very big company now as well.
Yeah, I think there's value. I think everybody should work in both. I think you'll learn things from big companies that you can take from small companies, and I think having experience in the small companies and understanding what is possible is really valuable to take to big companies too. Like, for example, if you work at a really small company, the distance between you and production is probably 30 seconds, maybe less, right? And you get to a big company maybe, and it's taking a couple of hours to get to production, maybe a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks. Maybe you have no access to the path to production at all. Being able to challenge, like, why? Yeah. And if you get the answer, well, it's not possible. You can, well, actually it is, because I've done it. And having that sort of healthy tension and experience levels between sort of startups and big companies, I think the middle of those two things is where productivity really is. Like you are going to get constraints as you get bigger. There's going to be certifications you want to get. There's going to be all sorts of compliance things you have to ensure happens. But then you should always keep that sort of, I don't want to call it scrappiness, but that that thought in your head that it really is possible to move much faster than this. So where's the healthy balance between those two things? And the people who I think do that best are people who've got experience of doing both, because they understand why the constraints are there, but they also understand what's possible.
Yeah. I think like you can either decide to feel stifled by that gap, or you can be curious about why, and then kind of you'll probably discover once you get context that it's there for really good reason. Is that your experience?
Yeah, for the most part, but there's definitely been situations where it's not been there for good reason. And just someone being willing to step up and say, like, why do we do it like this? And being willing to just keep digging and digging and digging until they can figure out why that decision was made or why we're doing it that way can be really valuable. And you can save a ton of cycle time by being willing to do that. So I think I really value those people who are willing to dig a little bit deeper and figure out why is it this way. And is that saying like if you say it's the way we've always done it, that's usually a good signal that there's probably some opportunity to improve things there.
Yeah, we recently had Rob Zuber on the podcast. He's the CTO at Circle CI, and he was talking about this topic. They have kind of like, they grew and then they kind of came back down to size in engineering, and he stepped back into the fold. And one of the areas he was really focused on was like removing that process that had built up over time to like readjust for the size. I think like there's so many companies that are kind of going through that process right now and trying to figure out where they can make things a bit more efficient. Is that where you spend a lot of your time thinking?
Definitely. And I think you've called out a really important point there, which is this is dynamic. Like you might make a decision in January that's not valid in December anymore. Like as the company grows, shrinks, priorities change, like you should reevaluate your processes as well as like your team compositions and your priorities, right? And I think you see companies often rethink their priorities, but I'm not sure they think about the way they work as much as they probably should.
Oh, yeah, I think that's 100% true. And so, yeah, you went from the big company on the grad scheme to the small company. What happened in between there and you landing at Cloudflare?
Yeah, so I worked at Crowdcube for around 12 months. I had a really great experience there. I learned tons because it was the first place that I got to work where I really did own like code change all the way through to production and then being on call as well. So understanding the life cycle of a product. I also was much closer to the business there, so I really liked it. So I really wanted to kind of continue that, but I wanted to focus more into like back-end engineering and something that I've been passionate about for a long time and was kind of using in my free time, but I wanted to bring to work was the programming language Go. I'd spent a ton of time like learning it at home, but I wasn't really able to bring it to work. So that was kind of my focus. It's like I want to use Go at work, and I also want to focus more on the back end. I was doing a lot more full stack at Crowdcube. So I ended up joining a fintech called Curve. Curve is really cool. If you've not seen it, the concept is effectively you get a single debit card and then you put all your other debit and credit cards behind it. And then you can set up smart rules and things like that. So you can say, if I pay in this country, use the MasterCard rate or use the cards rate because it's better. Or if it's lunchtime, then put the transaction on this card because that's where I want to put it.
I covered it actually as a startup reporter years and years ago. Met the founder. It was a really great way to collect loads of loyalty points at one point.
Yes. Yeah. We had a few people who were kind of gaming the product, but it's cool and it was interesting and it was disruptive. And I've always been interested in consumer finance. Like I've always been a budgeter and like really interested in like optimizing my loyalty points for various schemes and stuff. So it was a really nice fit for me. So I joined Curve when it was pretty small. I think there was about 30 of us. And I stayed there for, I think it was 2 years. But by the time I left, we were a couple of hundred people. So I kind of got to see that start up to scale up and all the things that happened in between. And I also got an opportunity as part of that to experience, I went from being sort of an individual contributor to having some, I wouldn't call it direct reports, but the way we structured things internally was tech leads were kind of responsible for some of the people management elements. So it was a useful way to learn a little bit about that space and what I enjoyed and what I didn't and how to balance your time between those things. So I really enjoyed it. It was a really great place to work and I learned a lot and I got to spend a lot of time writing Go, which is what I wanted to do. And then as the pandemic hit, I felt like it was time for me to do something a little bit different. Cloudflare has always been a company that I wanted to join. Like for me, it was like up there. It was up there as some people they aim for Google or Facebook. Yeah. Cloudflare was that for me. I loved their blog. And it's really interesting because as I interview people now, like it's our number one source of like, why do you want to join Cloudflare? It's like, oh, I read this blog post and it was super interesting. It continues to be a great channel for us to find talent. And I was no different. So, I applied there, didn't ever expect to really hear anything back, and went through the interview process and got to join, which was amazing. Like it was like a dream come true for me.
Yeah.
So that was challenging because I joined Cloudflare just as we went into lockdown in the UK. So I went from being an in-office worker at one company to a remote worker at a different one.
Yeah.
And Cloudflare itself was still figuring out how to do remote work. So it was definitely a transition. I found it really tough. It was also the first time that I'd joined a team that wasn't all in one place.
Mm-hmm.
Like most of my colleagues were going to be in the US.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how to navigate that and work together was certainly challenging, but it went really well for me. I really enjoyed my time in the team I was in. And I think after a year, I was promoted to be the tech lead of that team. Another year went by, really enjoyed the work. Our team grew. And my manager got promoted to be a director of multiple teams. And then I took the managerial role of the team that I was the IC in, which is still the team that I manage today.
Nice, yeah. So like kind of a journey we hear really often, that kind of IC to tech lead who's kind of doing some management, and then you're doing some management. Like, what did you learn along the way? And especially in that middle phase, like what part of it was like, oh, actually, this is a path I'm interested in?
So I think the more time you spend being an individual contributor, and as you start to maybe transition into that technical lead role, as to your point, you do a little bit of managery stuff, is you start to realize that whichever way you look at this, like all of this software work that you're doing, everything you're doing is ultimately about people. And you can swap programming languages, you can make that code a little bit more efficient, but ultimately everything comes down to like the ultimate way to get productivity, enjoy your job, enjoy your work, and deliver value is to have like a team that works really well together and feels like they trust each other, and has an environment where people feel they can speak to their colleagues about issues and ideas too, right? And so I guess I just kind of naturally started to discover that as much as I always loved writing code, like I also loved talking to people. I loved the conversations. I loved helping people. I loved unblocking people. I also even, in the role I do, I get to do a little bit of product management as well. I like putting that hat on too, right? And like figuring out what's the most impactful thing we can work on.
There's not many engineers that like putting that hat on. I really want to hear more about what you like about that.
Totally. So I think as I started to do more and more of those things, and to be honest, I'm not convinced I would have pursued a engineering manager role, but it was one of those things where the opportunity arose. My manager said, I think you'd be good at this. Like, what do you think? And my default reaction was no. Yes. But then when I kind of thought about it, I was like, the reason I'm saying no is because it scares me. Like, I think this is going to be hard. And that's probably the exact right reason I should try.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's been 2.5 years or so now, and I'm loving it.
What scared you about it?
I think it's really hard. So, So I think it's really hard to measure your success as an engineering manager. You can feel like you're doing all the right things and you're getting good feedback, but what if someone's just maybe not telling you what they're really thinking? Or and obviously there's things you can put in place to kind of hopefully account for that too, like anonymous surveys and things like that. But it's just it's really hard to have like just the data that outlines very clearly like how you're doing and how's it going. And it also changes the dynamic of the team too. So all these people who were my colleagues are now my direct reports.
Yeah, that's a hard transition.
Yeah, and I think, you'll be like, hey, we'll make a difference. Like we've got such a strong rapport, but it does, it always does. And it can be quite an isolating position. So I was quite concerned about the dynamic shift. Maybe that my colleagues who I worked with previously maybe wouldn't respect me as a manager and I wouldn't be able to do a good job. So all these things were kind of fears of mine. Also as an IC, it feels very easy to measure success. It's like, I've got to deliver this feature by this day. I've got to do this ticket by this day. I've got to review this PR, deliver it by whenever. It's very, very, very quantitative, right? You can move things across the board. You can say, oh, I did this much this week. You can't really do that as an engineering manager. And I think that's a really hard transition to get to. One of my managers said to me once, we were working on a project, and I said something along the lines of, oh, I've been doing planning at the moment, but I'm going to start work next week. And he was like, Matt, you've been working on it for weeks. Planning is work. And I think that's the best way I can kind of explain the shift in thinking. It's like you can't measure your outcomes. You can't measure your success by code anymore, and you've got to start thinking a little bit differently. And that transition was really hard for me, actually.
Yeah. So how did you figure out how to kind of bridge that gap? Obviously, it's really challenging. Like you're used to kind of measuring things in a certain way. You mentioned anonymous surveys. We haven't mentioned one-to-ones, all these normal tools that you have in your locker. What's the kind of mix that you've found that gives you that confidence or belief in that you're doing the right thing on that management side now?
Yeah, so I think I actually talked about it today. Is I think one of the most valuable things any team can do is have a retrospective regularly. And I think if you had to cancel everything else, that's the meeting to have. Yeah. If you have no stand-ups, you have no other interactions, have a retrospective every couple of weeks. And you might find at the start it doesn't feel that valuable because I think it takes a really long time to build trust that people can say things like, this isn't working, can we change it? And the only way to do that is to kind of, even if people raise small issues or small actions, is as a manager, your job is to go and chase those down and make impact. And as you start to make changes, people will realize, oh, I can have impact here, I can change things. And then people will start raising like deeper conversations, if you will. And from those, you can start to uncover like what's really sort of bothering the team. You also mentioned one-to-ones. Alongside retrospectives, like if you kind of get a feeling or you see something where you're like, I'm going to dig deeper with that person, or maybe someone's a bit more introverted and doesn't feel as comfortable raising it as a retrospective, they're a great time to surface those things too.
So what have you learned about running good retrospectives? Because I don't think many people run great retrospectives.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing I've learned is to like be really aggressive about time boxing time. It's very easy to just spend all of your time in one area and not actually get to any concrete action items. And then you kind of leave dissatisfied. Like you spent 2 hours talking about things. You felt like you were on the precipice of doing something great and getting to a great action, but you didn't quite get there. And so you have to find another meeting to set it up. You kind of leave it half-baked and people walk away with like, I didn't get any value there. So being able to say, we're going to spend 15 minutes as an open period where people can put down all their issues. I'll spend a quick 2 minutes grouping them. You can vote on a theme. And then we're going to talk about each theme for exactly 5 minutes. And then we have to make 2 action items for each of the themes that we discussed. And just being very rigorous with the time management is the way you've got to drive outcomes, as well as you have to get to concrete actions. If you don't get to concrete actions, it wasn't valuable.
Yeah, and another thing you talked about today was managing across time zones. What have you learned about kind of managing teams that are a bit more distributed than maybe most?
Yeah, but it's hard, and there's no good answers here. I think the retrospective is the way to make it work. You've got to find what's not working in your team composition and what you need to do to make that work, what changes you need to make. I had some folks approach me afterwards, and they're kind of saying like, I have this very specific problem in my teams that are distributed in this way. And I think they were almost disappointed that I couldn't just say, like, do this thing and it'll be great. Yeah. It was more, you've got to make space for people to raise issues and concerns, and then you've got to really take action on those things. So the retrospective is a great one. The other one that I think is if you are in a lot of time zones, as in maybe more than plus or minus 2 where you are, you're probably going to have to move to a model where asynchronous working is your default.
Yeah.
And I don't just mean raising pull requests and leaving time to review them. I mean that things that maybe would be a meeting become a long-form written wiki article or a very long email or something that people can digest in their own time and review it and then get back to you with feedback on. It means that sort of the decision-making loop can feel slower, but in the long run, if you can adopt that model, you'll be very successful with teams across time zones.
And do you go a little bit from kind of a speaking culture to a writing culture?
Yeah, and we're still working on this, to be clear. There's still things that we have synchronous meetings from, like, I wonder if this would work as a written document. But I think if you start to go down that transitionary path, you'll realize it's probably the right way to go to allow everybody to have sort of the work-life balance they want, and also to ensure that you're documenting all the decisions that you're making, as well as allowing diverse views into all of those sort of processes and projects that you're working on, right? So I think I'm reaching a point where I'm like, it has to be that way. I think to work across these time zones, like it really does have to be asynchronous. And I think the challenge is that's not going to suit everybody. As we've moved from an in-person culture to a remote culture, it's going to be a lot hard for a lot of people to move to that way of thinking and working. And some people may never get there. They may prefer to work in office. And I think we need to be honest about acknowledging that, right? There's going to be people who like working in very different ways. In the past, it was very much, everyone goes to the office. If you don't like it, tough. That's what we do. And there were some breakout companies, like the ones that come to mind, like Automatic and GitLab. Yeah. But they were seen as trailblazers, right? It's like, wow, they're fully remote. Whereas I'd say for a lot of people now, that's the default, at least 3 days a week or so. But we need to remember all those people who are optimal in the office. It worked better for them, and not go too far the other direction of remote working is for everybody, because it might not be.
Where do you fall personally?
I think where I've landed is plan in person and execute remotely is where I would love to be. This can't always happen, especially when you're as distributed as we are. Getting everyone in the same room is really, really challenging. But I think if there was no budget constraints and everybody was available to travel at one point, I would get everyone in the room maybe for a week every quarter. We'd do a ton of planning and just team building and get to spend time together. And once we figured out exactly what we can do, we'd go away and we'd execute remotely.
And you mentioned like the difficulties with transitioning to management. What were the other areas that you found kind of challenging, and how did you go about kind of figuring those parts out?
Yeah. One thing that I thought was really interesting is I'd always had one-to-ones with my managers, right? So I've had maybe 5 or 6 managers in my career, maybe more. So I know how my one-to-ones look. You don't get to see anyone else's one-to-ones, right?
Yeah.
So you don't know what sort of questions other people are going to ask. You don't know like what their concerns are going to be. You don't really know how they like to structure things, or if they're going to structure them well at all. So you can obviously ask people, like, what's your preference? But if you ask that question, you get some really interesting answers, because people say, I've never been asked that before. I don't really know. I just kind of turned up and we spoke about whatever we spoke about. So trying to find a structure that allowed people to get what they needed, I guess, out of one-to-ones was a really interesting challenge for me. And the answer to that was to find mentors, do lots of reading, and ask the question, like, how do you run to one-to-ones? Like, what are the best one-to-ones you've been part of? Like, how do I be great at this? And there's some really great books.
What's the best answer you've got to that question?
The best answer I got was that to provide a structure, and the one that I really like is progress plans problems. So you put those into a document and you ask folks to fill that in every week. Like before a one-to-one, just spend 10 minutes jotting down your thoughts here. I found that brought structure to pretty much everybody's one-to-ones. And then what I did for certain people who were they clearly knew what they wanted out of their one-to-one, right? You can go off piece then, you can go off track. You don't need the structure, but if someone's coming to one-to-ones, they don't really have any questions, they don't have any concerns, they're just kind of, they're giving you project updates, and then maybe in return you're having a quick chat about personal life and stuff, which is obviously great and important.
Yeah, useful.
But then something happens like 3 or 4 days later, and maybe you weren't aware of it, or you wish it could have been flagged a little bit earlier. Adding that structure to them gives them a really great start. And also we make a point of hiring like interns and graduates at Cloudflare. And so just having like a standard, like this is a really great way to start framing one-to-ones. Framing one-to-ones is really powerful, and I found that really useful too.
Nice. All right, I'm going to shift now to talking about Priority Zero. This is the Priority Zero podcast. We talk about that one thing that's right at the top of your list right now. What's yours?
So in November, Cloudflare had a really major incident where we, for all intents and purposes, like we were down for a couple of days. There's a very public blog post about this. If you search for Code Orange, you'll find it.
Sounds serious.
It was serious. A very short summary of it is like one of our data centers went offline, and we were massively over-indexed on that data center. So, ever since then, we've had a huge emphasis on making sure everything is highly available and that our infrastructure is solid. And that's
the kind of the promise you give to customers, isn't it?
100% the promise we give to customers. But my focus is internal teams, and we need to give the same promise to our internal teams. They can't give that promise to customers if we don't give it to them.
Yes.
So my focus has been very much on making sure all of our developer tooling is going to be available, like whatever happens. If someone takes a data center off the internet, like we have redundancy everywhere, and we've got things in place that my goal is always that an engineer at Cloudflare shouldn't even know that anything has happened. Like if a data center's gone offline, they may see a quick blip where we bring something else online or some cutover happens. They don't need to change any configuration. They don't need to do anything like that. And that's kind of been my priority zero since November, effectively, is like, how do we get to a place where every single tool at Cloudflare, especially the ones that are needed for the path to production, is highly available to all engineers at all times.
So where do you start with that? Where do you start to map out how you start to work towards that priority zero?
Yeah, so it all starts with retrospectives again. So we had 2 different forms of retrospective for this. So typically when I've hosted retrospectives in the past, they're all very sort of insular. It's just your team, and you're figuring out how you could have done better in the way you were working and maybe the things you were working on. This time was more, we kind of looked outwardly to our customers, which is engineering in our case, right? And figured out like, what could we have done better for you? And there's some really obvious wins there. It's like, well, this tool wasn't available at all. Like that's easy. But then there was tons of really interesting output from that too around educational gap. Like I thought this tool did this, but it turned out it actually worked a little bit more this way. And it's like, oh, that's super interesting. That's like a softer thing we need to work on rather than just kind of like making sure everything is in all the different data centers and whatnot, right? So was having those retrospectives both internally and externally, but externally for us is still engineering within Cloudflare, figuring out what would have the biggest impact that we should be working on immediately, and then just kind of building a backlog around this sort of hardening, as we called it, like making sure everything was in a really good spot. If that incident ever happened again, like we feel really good that we would be in a much better spot to deal with it. And that incident did happen again in February, and we were in a great spot to deal with it. The impact, I don't even think there was any sort of real impact to customers. We did a really great job. So just having those priority conversations and ensuring you have like a really good you have really good metrics about what you're trying to achieve. Like what's the impact of the work you're trying to do? What are you trying to solve for? Like what's actually the problem, and what's great look like?
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of chipping away at that over time and making sure you're incrementally working towards that is essential.
Yeah. So I always ask where do you need to get to for this no longer to be priority zero? And it sounds like you had a good test case in February to kind of see how far along you are. Like how close are you to bringing that down to P1?
I think for me, I'll always try and think of this as a priority zero. I think it's very easy, especially, it's very easy to take your eye off the ball in terms of like highly available infrastructure and making sure all of your tooling is available at all times for everybody. But I think I never want to get to a place where it's not a priority, right? So I think being able to measure what great looks like and maybe have continuous measurements of what great looks like is really powerful. Something we do at Cloudflare is we actually have, I think Netflix kind of made the paradigm popular, but like Chaos Monkey, right?
Yeah, chaos engineering.
Yeah, you inject chaos into your infrastructure and see what happens. We do that regularly. So we're always learning and finding opportunities to improve. And honestly, if we find anything that is like, that's a failure mode that we weren't ready for, it goes straight to the top of our backlog. So we always try and keep that P0 mentality. And to be honest, I'll try and always keep that going forward now, because I think for our team specifically, it just has to be true.
Yeah. Right. Reliability has to be right at the top.
Has to be, yeah.
And we always like to end the show on a recommendation. So is there anything you've read, watched, listened to recently that you want to recommend?
Yeah, so I listen to a podcast regularly called Acquired, and I think it's one of the best podcasts out there. So it started out telling the stories of companies like being acquired and like their journey to IPO, but it's now become like a business history podcast. So the last episode was around Starbucks, and it started with like the foundation of Starbucks all the way through to like modern day. They've covered Visa. They've covered Tesla, and they're just so interesting. Like they dig really deep. These are like 3-hour-long podcasts. Like it's not for everybody, but if you scroll through the list of companies that they've covered, I'd be very surprised if there's something that's not interesting to others. One slightly off-piste one they did was on Taylor Swift.
Yes.
They told the story of Taylor Swift and her rise and like how the music industry works. So interesting. I love that stuff.
Well, I just saw her on Friday in Edinburgh, so I'm definitely going to check that one out.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Right, Matt, thanks so much for coming on here. It was really great hearing about your journey and about your Priority Zero. Hope to see you again soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you again for listening to Priority Zero, a Lead Dev podcast. Remember, you can get us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify. But when you do, please remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And we hope to see you at the next one.